Victim blaming is the act of holding a victim of a crime or abuse responsible for the harm that has been inflicted upon them. This type of thinking shifts the focus away from the perpetrator and places it on the victim, as if they were at fault for what happened to them. Examples of victim blaming include saying things like they were asking for it, they shouldn't have been wearing that, or they should have known better. This type of thinking is not only unfair to the victim, but it also perpetuates a culture that excuses abuse and violence. It can also make it harder for victims to come forward and seek help, as they may feel ashamed or blamed for what happened to them. Despite the harm caused by victim blaming, there are still those who oppose efforts to stop this practice. They argue that victims bear some responsibility for what happens to them and that focusing on the perpetrators excuses their behavior. Quotes like "people need to take responsibility for their own safety" or "victims should have known better" are often used to justify victim blaming. However, these arguments are based on a flawed understanding of crime and abuse. The reality is that perpetrators, not victims, are responsible for their actions. Victims of violence and abuse often have limited control over what happens to them and should never be blamed for the harm inflicted upon them. The term blaming the victim was first introduced by psychologist William Ryan in his 1971 book of the same name. In the book, Ryan described victim blaming as an ideology used to justify racism and social injustice against Black people in the United States. Why does victim blaming happen? Victim blaming can happen for a variety of reasons, including social conditioning. Society often reinforces the belief that victims are responsible for their own experiences. This can be seen in cultural attitudes, media portrayals, and other sources of information. Lack of understanding. People who engage in victim blaming may have limited knowledge or understanding of the dynamics of abuse and violence. This can lead them to believe that victims could have done something differently to prevent what happened to them. Cognitive biases. People may unconsciously hold biases that lead them to place blame on victims rather than perpetrators. For example, gender stereotypes may lead someone to believe that a woman who was sexually assaulted was asking for it because of the way she was dressed. Defensiveness. When someone is confronted with information about a crime or abuse, they may feel defensive and want to distance themselves from the situation. Blaming the victim is a way for them to feel less vulnerable and to maintain a sense of control over their own safety. Excusing perpetrators. By blaming the victim, people can excuse the behavior of the perpetrator and avoid confronting the reality of the harm that was inflicted. Victim blaming is not limited to one culture or region. In Somalia, for instance, victims of sexual abuse face social ostracism and harassment. In February 2016, a study by International Alert and UNICEF revealed that girls and women who were released from captivity by Nigeria's Boko Haram faced rejection by their communities and families, and their children born of sexual violence faced even more discrimination. Acid attacks on women in South Asia are another example of victim blaming. For example, in 2022 in New Delhi, a group of men threw acid on a 16-year-old girl because they believed she provoked the advances of a man. In Chinese culture, victim blaming is often associated with the crime of rape, as women are expected to resist rape using physical force. If rape occurs, it is considered to be at least partly the woman's fault, and her virtue is inevitably called into question. In Western culture, victim blaming has been largely recognized as problematic, but Westerners are still guilty of this type of thinking. Where the Los Angeles School District tried to blame a 14-year-old girl for the sexual abuse she endured from her teacher. The district's lawyer argued that the minor was responsible for the prevention of the abuse, putting the entire fault on the victim and exempting the perpetrator of any responsibility. Despite the lawyer's efforts to convince the court that the victim must be blamed, the ruling stated that no minor student who has been sexually assaulted by his or her teacher is responsible for the prevention of that sexual assault. Overall, victim blaming perpetuates a culture that excuses abuse and violence, and can make it harder for victims to come forward and seek help. It's important to challenge